Good evening, everyone. First thing I want to say is it's really, really awesome to see a full room. Sometimes when we have this conversation, parents don't show up. So I just want to start by applauding you guys for being here and for committing to your kids and to learning about this conversation, so thank you for that. My name is Jessica Wong. I work at the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation. Anybody ever heard of it? Small little treatment center, been around about 70 years. I specifically work at our Plymouth location. Less people know about that. We work with adolescents and young adults there. We've been around for almost 40 years. We treat 12 to 25-year-olds there, so that's kind of the angle that I'm coming at our conversation from tonight. I'm also a certified prevention professional from the state of Minnesota. This is my colleague Cindy Palmer.
Hi everybody, thank you so much for showing up tonight. We really appreciate it. I also work for the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation. I've been in healthcare over 30 years and behavioral healthcare specifically for the last 10 years. You're probably wondering, the Top Secret Project, why are we at the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation doing a presentation like this? And what's the deal with it? Well, this is the deal. Sorry, I'm going the wrong way. We see treatment services at the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation. There's also prevention services, intervention services, treatment, and so forth. But what happens when you're looking for something, when you think something's going on with your child and you don't know what it is and you don't know what to look for? We saw a big hole, so we thought, you know what, we need to look at the professionals around our community and get their feedback for maybe something that they can give us feedback on. So we worked with different coalitions. We worked with the Minnesota County Attorney's Office. We worked with the Minnesota Crime Prevention Association. We worked with a lot of people. We worked for over a year putting this presentation together to determine what things to look for that could potentially be an issue.
So at our facility in Plymouth, Minnesota, we treat approximately 1,400 young people who are struggling with addiction and co-occurring mental health issues. And that's kids from across the country. About 50% of those kids come from here in the state of Minnesota. 50% come from elsewhere in the United States. And about the average kiddo has 2.14 family members. So if we look at the average family size, they've got a couple of people in their immediate family. So that means that the kiddos that we treat, altogether we have about 4,500 individuals and immediate family members who are affected by addiction in the kiddos that we serve each year. But nationally across the country, there are about 9.5 million young people between the ages of 12 and 17 or their family members who are needing help with this disease. And so that's why this is an important conversation. We're going to talk a lot about different areas tonight, but there's just over about 200,000 young people or family members of young people in the state of Minnesota who are in a life-threatening battle with the disease of addiction. And so that's why Cindy and I do this work and travel around not only the state of Minnesota, but around the country having this conversation. And every single parent who has brought their son or daughter to our treatment facility has at one point or another said, that will never be my kid. And so it's really easy to find ourselves in that comfortable place of saying, our kids are safe, they go to a great school, we educate them, we talk to them about it, but the fact of the matter is, addiction can impact anyone. It can impact good students, good athletes, and so we want to make sure that everyone is educated about, the warning signs, the things to look for, and the different things that you can see around the house that might be an indication that a young person is struggling. And maybe it might not be your young person, but it could be a young person that you know, somebody that your kid goes to school with, somebody that you know from your worship community or in a number of other ways. The other reason we do this is because there are a number of young people each year who lose their lives to the disease of addiction or to other related mental health issues. And it doesn't need to be this way. And so our goal, as Cindy mentioned early on, is to kind of get out there in a prevention fashion and educate people on the front end so that we can prevent young people from going down the road that these 5 young people here did, and hopefully help people get help earlier on, and maybe never need the services of somebody like a Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation. Keep our healthy kids healthy, keep them moving on the right track. So, the fact of the matter is, every young person who has struggled, whether it's been with an addiction or a mental health issue, there has always been signs along the way. Every parent has been able to sort of look back in retrospect and say, you know, now that I think about it, there's different things that sort of make sense now. And so that's what we're going to spend a lot of time talking about tonight. As you went through the bedroom, you probably saw some things that were pretty obvious. You're probably like, okay, yeah, if I saw that in my kid's room, I'd know right away we're having a conversation. There might have been some other things in the bedroom that were less obvious, and we'll touch on those things too. Maybe some normal everyday household items that if you saw them in your kid's room, you wouldn't have thought a whole lot about them. But after our conversation tonight, maybe we can teach you to look at things a little bit differently, especially if it's in combination with some other changes in behavior and things. But just to sort of keep your eyes open and not fall into sort of that comfort of believing everything's okay and just always being sort of curious and kind of always on the lookout to make sure that we're keeping our kiddos safe. So has anybody heard of the Minnesota Student Survey? I think we confirmed when we were here last time that you guys do it. There's 170,000 students in the state of Minnesota who participate in the Minnesota Student Survey in grades 5, 8, 9, and 11. The survey looks at a lot of different things, including substance use and mental health. So one of the statistics looks at suicide. So here if we look at the percentage of 9th through 12th grade students who said they have seriously considered suicide in the past year was 16%. You can see the breakdown there by gender, certainly lower for males, but an alarming number nonetheless. Something to be concerned about and something to be on the lookout. We also see that the percentage of 9th through 12th grade students who reported a suicide attempt one or more times was 10%, according to the Minnesota Student Survey. So we see that our kiddos are struggling, and what we also know about mental health issues is that mental health issues oftentimes go hand in hand with substance use. You've probably heard the term self-medicating. So when our kids are struggling with anxiety or depression, sometimes they will turn to things like alcohol or marijuana or other substances to help sort of relieve the feelings that they're feeling. So we're going to talk about some of these things throughout the course of the night.
So you see on the screen here, we have a trumpet mouthpiece, we have an inhaler, we have a highlighter, we have an apple. What do you think that these items have in common? And please shout it out. All right. We have a little quiet group here, and feel free. Yeah. These are different drug delivery systems. Kids can be super creative. They can put a trumpet mouthpiece onto a Pringles can. They can take out the medication that was prescribed to them and put in the medication of their choice. Highlighters can be used for a couple of different things. What they'll do is take out the insert of the highlighter. They'll place their pills or marijuana or drugs of choice in there. Also, they can be used for a pipe. They'll put a couple holes in it and smoke from it. We hear this from our treatment center at the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation in Plymouth, from our counselors, that a lot of fruits and vegetables that can be cored out can be smoked out of. And that's a very popular way that kids get high. So that's not to say that if you see your child eating an apple, that they may indeed have a drug problem. That is not what we're saying here at all. But what we're saying is if you see on a regular basis that maybe they're having fruits or vegetables laying around that maybe have a specific funny odor, or maybe some tinfoil, or some holes poked in them. Again, like we're talking about, everyday items that could potentially be the start of a problem. So I just have to ask you, was there anything in the room that you looked at that you potentially had some questions about? We can answer right now. Yes?
It seemed to me like it was kind of a mail room until I saw the first.
It is a mailroom, and that was supposed to be under a shirt, so ignore the purse.
So it was the mom's purse in the mailroom.
Yeah, the mom left her purse in the room when she was giving the son cash for the football game.
So the answer to that, the purse in the room, is we have done over 100 of these presentations, or for a lot of different places, and it's male and female, and it does not discriminate. So sorry about that.
There was another hand in the back over here. Or other people.
There's me, sorry.
Yeah.
What about the C4? The canister of the C4?
Are you talking about the stuff that's on the desk?
Yeah, it was a canister of C4 on the desk.
The canister of what?
So the air that you use to blow out a computer?
It's a,
Oh yeah, okay, the protein powder.
yeah.
Yes, okay. So this is an area of the presentation we won't get to tonight, so I'm glad that you asked about this. One of the things we can talk about in this presentation, if we had 8 hours, is eating disorders, because there's also a high connection to eating disorders and substance use. So somebody using protein powder to supplement their workouts, in and of itself, not an issue, absolutely not. But combined with several other things you might have seen in the room, like toilet bowl cleaner. What are some of the other eating disorders?
Some of the muscle magazines, there was a scale
Mouthwash.
in there,
Mouthwash,
obsessive about weighing
yeah.
their food, different things like that. Maybe we could go on and on.
Yep, so if you start to see a combination of things that looks like maybe somebody's obsessive about working out, eating a certain way, having a certain diet, then it could be a sign that they have disordered eating or a full-blown eating disorder, because oftentimes the behaviors go hand in hand. So that kind of goes back to Cindy's point about the apple, that one thing we want parents to know is the most important thing to look for isn't a specific item, it's about changes in your kids. You know your kids. And if your kid has tried protein powder and they don't like it, and all of a sudden they're buying it obsessively, and they're cleaning the toilet constantly, which might be a sign that they're binging and purging, and they're spending 8 hours a day at the gym, and so you're starting to get a story here that something's off and that's very different for your kid, something is worth your attention to look into a little further. So a lot of the items in the room by themselves are not concerning. But when you look at it in the context of what you know of your kid and their behaviors, it could be an indication. For me, if I saw protein powder in my kid's room, I'd go, huh, tell me about that. Like, why did you buy that? What was that about for you? Question in the back.
It was a little metal tool, looked like a dental tooth cleaner.
It was in one of the drawers?
Yes.
So there's a small metal tool, it looks like a dental pick, it was in the drawer of the desk. That tool is commonly used to make marijuana wax, which is a highly concentrated version of marijuana, potency up to 90%. Cindy's going to talk about that in a little bit. It's typically used to scrape the wax off of whatever parchment paper or wax paper you're using if you're making marijuana wax at home. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. Other things that stood out to you that looked odd or weird that you had questions about? Okay, we'll go through a few more items, and then if other things pop up, we'll check in with you in a little bit. So we're going to talk a little bit about alcohol for a little bit. Anybody know what this is a picture of? Gummy bears. Anybody know what's special about these gummy bears? I see pot. I can tell you these particular gummy bears, at least the ones that are bigger, are soaked in alcohol. And that's why they're bigger. So you can soak gummy bears in alcohol, which makes the taste of alcohol a little bit easier to bear, because a lot of kids who try alcohol for the first time will tell you that they don't like the taste. So they get very creative in trying to find ways to ingest alcohol where they don't have to taste it, but they get the effects. So this is one of the ways they do it. And I'm just going to take you through very quickly just a few of the different ways kids will ingest alcohol, just to show you kind of the extent that kids will go to. This kid in this picture here is snorting alcohol, much the way you hear of kids or people in general snorting other drugs, going directly into his nasal passages. Here is a picture. You can actually mainline alcohol and inject it directly into your bloodstream. Purpose of some of these is that you get drunker faster, and it's a much more intense intoxication. This one here I put up because also this is one that we have dealt with specifically at our facility. This is hand sanitizer. We're not allowed to have hand sanitizer at our facility that has any alcohol content in it, because especially for the young kiddos that don't have access to alcohol, things like hand sanitizer, mouthwash, perfume, or cologne that are known to have high alcohol content potentially could be something that they would use to get that feeling of intoxication. A couple of other ones here. This young man is doing something called eyeballing, where he's pouring alcohol directly into his eye. The belief here is that the membrane around the eye is so thin that it will go directly into the bloodstream, and again, you'll get drunker faster, because in this digital era, we don't want to wait. We don't want to sit around with our red Solo cup and sip a beer and maybe hopefully get a buzz. We want to get drunk right now. And so it'll go directly into that thin membrane around the eye, and we'll get drunk right away, and it'll be that much more intense. The reality is, people end up in the emergency room with damage to their eyes, but anybody want to take a guess why more than one kid has tried this? YouTube, TikTok, any social media. So back in the olden days, before that, you'd have to know somebody who did this, and that would kind of spread the old-fashioned way. But one kid puts this on social media, and then many other kids across the country, across the world say, hey, I'm going to try that, even though it doesn't actually produce the desired effect. So it's still something to look out for. We're going to talk a little bit about vaping and juuling, because we hear a lot about that in the news. In the traditional sense as it relates to both nicotine and marijuana, but you can also vape alcohol, which is what this young man is doing with a few household items that include an empty 2-liter bottle of soda and a bike pump and a couple of other things. Here, this is a tampon soaking in alcohol. Both young men and women use this. You can get intoxicated off of this. It's odorless. If you were to do a breath alcohol test, you would not test positive. So there's a lot of very creative, sneaky ways that kids can get intoxicated, where people would not know that they're even getting drunk while they're having a conversation with them. And then this is something called whip-a-haul, and really just put up here as a placeholder for sort of this growing movement of alcohol-infused cuisine. I'm not talking about cuisine where we cook with alcohol, where the alcohol is cooked off. I'm talking about cuisine where we're cooking in the alcohol so that as you eat pizza or a burger or any number of things, the purpose of it is to get drunk while you're eating it. So whip-a-haul is just one of many examples. So as you think about alcohol consumption and your young people or the young people in your life, know that there's a variety of different ways that they could be consuming this. And one thing that's concerning about a lot of these different methods that we're talking about is that most of these methods bypass the normal metabolic system, the old-fashioned way of just drinking a drink. And what does your body do if you drink too much? Your body treats too much alcohol as a poison, so your body has a way of ridding itself of that poison. But when you inject alcohol or vape alcohol or do a number of these other things that we've talked about, the body cannot rid itself of that poison. So you see kids not understanding how to dose properly, ending up in the emergency room, alcohol poisoning, or potentially worse. So these are definitely things to keep your eyes out for.
So let's look how kids are really tricky and creative. You'll see the Diet Coke can, and we don't have one on example here, but it's up there. We have Diet Coke cans, Monster drinks, you saw an Ajax a cleaner up there, that was the same thing. You can get these at the Container Store, as well as online, as well as at head shops, and the top screws off, and they're just in a nice little storage place that kids can keep their drugs of choice. Also Altoid mint containers. We have seen in our treatment facility where kids will come into residential treatment and they think they're pretty sneaky, and they'll have bars of soap that will be cut in half, and they'll put their drugs in the middle of this bar of soap and then kind of squeeze it together. And deodorants, they'll put the deodorants, screw it all the way off, cut it in half, put the weed in the bottom of the deodorant, and so the deodorant smells okay, so you're not smelling any of the marijuana or anything like that. Even slip ball, why would that be something to be concerned about? Well, there's a big problem today with marijuana wax, as Jessica mentioned. That's the intense THC, And what kids are doing, they're making marijuana wax and they're putting it into the EOS lip balms as well as the chapstick containers. And so if you see an EOS lip balm or chapstick and it has a funny odor, but it looks like chapstick, you may want to bring it into the local authorities, because it could be the marijuana wax, which is actually a felony if you're caught with it.
By the way, if you find EOS lip balm or something that you think might be marijuana wax and you bring it into the police station because you're not sure what it is, you won't get charged with a felony because you're concerned that you found something.
Correct.
If you're turning it in because you found something and you're curious about what it is, they're going to consider you as somebody who's bringing it in and trying to keep people safe, not as somebody that they're going to turn around and arrest for having this in their possession. So just keep that in mind. A couple of other things in the room I just wanted to point out that you might have seen that we get a lot of questions on, like the flip-flops on the floor. Typically people think those are fairly benign. In fact, we did this presentation, I'll pick on Wisconsin, because I don't happen to be a Packers fan. And we were in Wisconsin and these two mothers were walking through the room and the one mom said to the other mom, well, what do you think the flip-flops are for? And then the other mom said, well, I don't know, but I'm never going to buy flip-flops again. And what the flip-flops can be used for is you can take an X-Acto knife and slice the rubber and place pills in the slices of the rubber. And you'd never see the pills. So that's actually what's in the room. So after the presentation, anybody wants to go pop back up there and look at anything a second time and see if anything stands out differently to you, we invite you to do that. But there's a ton of creative ways to hide things. There's a book on the chest called The Lovely Bones. Has anybody seen the movie Shawshank Redemption? One of my favorite movies. If you've seen it, you remember that he carved out some pages in the book to hide the pick that he used to slowly chip away at the wall to break out of prison. Same thing with that book. So there's pages carved out and then there's actually a pipe hidden in that book. So again, your kid could have a book on a bookshelf that's actually hiding something. And so another thing that looks fairly benign and innocuous, that would be another sign. Same thing with the football and the teddy bear, all sorts of things that can be cut open with different things stashed and hidden inside. So again, it's not to drive you crazy and terrify you and make you think, oh my gosh, I have to go home and flip the mattress and do a raid on my kid's bedroom, but more to know that there's a lot more than meets the eye sometimes, especially if you're noticing some different behaviors in your kids or in some kids that maybe you have in your life, neighbors or family friends or what have you, and that these might be some things that you want to keep an eye out for.
Marijuana. We're going to talk a little bit about marijuana because so many states now have approved it for recreational use. Of course, in the state of Minnesota, it is approved for medicinal use only. Of course, the active ingredient that gets you high in marijuana is THC, delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol. That's probably why they call it THC for short. As far as youth using marijuana, there's a couple of reasons here on the board that it should not be approved for recreational use. You can read here, increased likelihood of other risky behaviors, increased risk for mental health issues, negative impact on school and athletics, impaired cognitive functioning, and increased risk of addiction. Now the last one, increased risk of addiction. Everybody says, well, marijuana, it's safe, it's not addictive. That's not the case. Actually, there's been research shown that if an adolescent starts using marijuana and they use into adulthood, 1 in 6 will become addicted to marijuana. Now, 85% of those that are in our residential treatment facility in Plymouth have a dependence to marijuana. Does that mean that that's all that they're using and that's why they're in residential treatment? Absolutely not. Typically, people that are in residential treatment, they've probably been to 4 or 5 different outpatient facilities, intensive outpatient, and it's just not working. And so they'll go into a residential treatment, and by that point, they're polysubstance users, which that means they're really using anything they can get their hands on to feel different and act different. So that's really the issue with that. Ways to use marijuana. Okay, we're used to the pipe. We're used to smoking a joint. But today, it's really, really different, and you have to be careful, and you have to be aware There's a lot of edibles out there. There's a lot of drinks out there. There's a lot of food products out there. You can have chicken carbonara with THC in it. You can have your coffee in the morning with THC in it. You can really have almost anything, and it's out there online with THC in it because it's legalized in a lot of the different states. And of course in Minnesota, it's not legalized for recreational use, so we're not really aware of that. So we like to make people aware of what's really out there. Now THC. In the 1960s, it was about 0.5%. That's how much THC was in marijuana when they would randomly test it. Looking at 2014, it's up to 14% on average. That's a totally different high today than that of the 1960s. Now you look into marijuana wax, what we briefly talked about, you can have concentrations up to that 90+%. Now you're thinking, well, what's the big deal with that? It is a big deal because what's happening when these kids are smoking and getting high on concentrated marijuana, they're going into psychosis. We see some of these kids staying in psychosis in our facilities for up to 3 weeks at a time before they're getting out of it. So it's very dangerous, it's a very different kind of high, and we like to educate people about that. Marijuana wax. Oh, do you have a question?
Thank you. You said it was up to 14%?
14% in 2014 and 2018, so 2019, it's probably about 17–18% today. On an average. Of course, you know, it depends on where you get it, where they get it, if it's legalized marijuana, if it's not legalized, and they're getting it on the black market. So that's an average. Any other questions so far? All right, marijuana wax. It's also called dabbing, and as you can see, some of the slang terms on the right-hand side of your screen, dab, shatter, wax, crumble, honeycomb, butter, and pull it and snap. It has a lot of different types of looks depending on the concentration of the THC in the marijuana. Now, how do kids make this? It's pretty dang easy. You can take a flat iron, some parchment paper, a marijuana bud, heat it up. The THC will come off of the marijuana bud onto the parchment paper, and then that little device that you saw, you would scrape that off the parchment paper, and that's your marijuana wax. That's your concentrated THC. And then what they do is they put it in the EOS lip balm, and they can rub it on their lips, they'll rub it in their mouth, they'll put it on a spoon and smoke from it. There are so many ways that you can ingest marijuana these days. Speaking of different ways, edibles. So little Johnny goes to a party, right? They have a couple of beers at the party, and little Johnny's older brother had some marijuana gummy bears. So he gives each of them a gummy bear. First of all, let me backtrack and tell you that an average dose of THC, to get an average person high, is about 5 milligrams, right? So little Johnny gives his friends each one gummy bear. How much THC do you think is in one gummy bear? Anybody know? The answer is about 10 milligrams. So they're getting about an average dose to get high in one gummy bear. And I don't know about you, but gummy bears to me, if I can't just eat one, it's kind of like a potato chip, right? So they have this gummy bear, and 2 to 4 hours go by and they don't feel a thing. So what are they gonna do? They're gonna have some more, right? The thing is when you ingest an edible, a marijuana edible, it takes 2 to 4 hours to kick in, right? Whereas when you smoke marijuana, you can get high within 5 to 10 minutes. So that's a problem when we're not educating people about the effects. Going through your metabolic system is completely different than smoking the marijuana. And when an edible will stay in your system up to 12 hours, that's a long time. In the state of Colorado, we don't hear a lot of the negative stuff about marijuana. We always hear about the positives and how it's great and it's going to be great for the communities and they're going to whatever. But the negative is that The kids, they think these are edibles on here. These are actual edibles. Kids don't know that. They don't know the difference. They had ER visits up 150% in the state of Colorado in the year of 2017, where he had to make a bill into law and that the manufacturers could no longer make edibles looking like humans, animals, or fruits. And the reason being is because kids were getting so sick and going to the ER, thinking it was regular candy and it wasn't. So we just have to be aware. Any questions? And like I said before, these are actual pictures on the screen of THC-infused food. From drinks, to candies, to blue cheese salad dressing, jam for your toast, and Fruity Loops in the morning. So let's talk a little bit about the 3 different areas of abuse that occur in adolescents and young adults. The first area of abuse is prescription medication. With prescription medications are the medications that affect the central nervous system. And those are for the sleep disorders, the anxieties, and things like that. So you see on the top of your screen, Valium, Xanax, Halcion, Prosom. Why would kids abuse this and what do they do? We hear from some of our chemical health counselors in the schools that some kids are taking Xanax, bars of Xanax, putting them in their water bottles with some juice and sipping on them all day long to get high. The next group is the stimulants. Now, you've probably heard of the Adderalls, the Dexedrine, the Vyvanses for ADHD. And they serve a real good purpose. My daughter has ADHD. She's on these medications. She needs this medication. However, this is a medication that can be completely abused. If you do not have ADHD and you are using this medication, it gives you a cocaine type of an effect. So, and it's not just abused by those that just want to get that high. It's abused by the straight A students that want to keep that straight A and they want to keep studying through the night so they can ace that test. It is also used by the athletes that want to swim a little faster, play that football game a little bit better. So again, that's another area of abuse that we're seeing, especially prevalent in colleges. Last but not least, and we're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this, is the opioids. What is an opioid? Well, it's a prescription medication for pain, and it is from a physician or nurse practitioner given. So let's say little Johnny breaks his leg, goes to the hospital, has surgery. He's given a opioid for the pain, rightly so. But guess what? He feels really good on this. So what's he going to do? He's going to double up on that dose because he feels so good, because he wants to feel the way he did. So he keeps taking it. He goes back. He gets it refilled. He goes back to school. He's out of his refills, but he still wants to feel that way. So he tries to drug seek and find somebody that maybe is selling this. But guess what? They're $25, $30 a pill. He's in high school. He can't afford it. And so then the next step, and this happens, is they go to heroin. Why heroin? Because heroin is an opioid and has a lot of the same chemical compounds as an opioid, and it's cheaper and it's easier to access.
So according to the U.S. Surgeon General, the United States makes up 5% of the world's population, yet we consume 80% of the world's supply of oxycodone and 99% of the world's supply of hydrocodone. So a lot of people, you've heard in the news, I'm sure, over and over, conversations about the opioid epidemic. This still continues to be an issue. We see evidence of this in our treatment centers. It's an ongoing conversation. A lot of people ask sort of why and how did we get here. There are a lot of ways that we got here. This is one of them. This is not the only way. But you know, a lot of people talk about sort of that over-prescribing of pain medications as pain became the 5th vital sign in emergency rooms. We talk about sort of patient satisfaction. If I'm a patient, I go in to the emergency room and I'm in pain, as pain is a fifth vital sign. If I leave and I'm given a patient satisfaction survey and I leave still in pain, I'm going to rate my experience very poorly. And so there's a lot of things that have come into play to sort of create this perfect storm that we've seen over the last 10 or 15 years that have led to the opioid epidemic. Not only that we've seen as it relates to prescription opioids, but then that has sort of also translated into the heroin use that Cindy talked about. About a quarter of patients who are prescribed opioids for pain misuse them, as Cindy described in her example, and about 80% of people who use heroin first used prescription opioids. So very few people just start with heroin. They're oftentimes coming to heroin by way of prescription opioids. You can think of prescription opioids as lab-created opioids versus heroin, which would be more street created, but kind of same chemical makeup. And in 2017, 64,000 Americans died of a drug overdose, and 75% of those overdoses were related to opioids specifically. So by far and away, the most deadly drug that we see as it relates to overdoses. I'll take you through this time lapse quickly. Watch the map as I click through. The red counties in the United States are counties where there is an opioid epidemic as defined by the Centers for Disease Control, where we're seeing epidemic levels of overdose deaths. So I'll click through 2002, 2003, just click forward through time here and watch as more counties turn red. 2008, 2010, 2013. Here you see a side-by-side. Certainly we have more current data than 2013. Unfortunately, they didn't scale the data the same that they did for this data, so it wouldn't have been a one-for-one comparison to continue with the time lapse, but this trend has not changed. If we were to fast forward this to 2018 or 2019, we would continue to see this trend going in the wrong direction. I think we're sort of at a tipping point with this as far as education and seeing this starting to move in the right direction. You're seeing it's harder to get prescription pain medications. They're really restricting the times when they prescribe them. They're really doing a better job of tracking who and when and how they prescribe them, and changing policies in terms of needing to present IDs when you pick up controlled substances like opioids. So there's a lot of things that are in play that are starting to change this picture, and hopefully as we move forward we will see this start to reverse and change. But in our adolescent facility, we've seen as high as 55% of our patients in our facility for an opioid dependence. And so at its highest peak, it was pretty high. I think today it's probably closer to 35% for our kiddos that we see. So Cindy's going to talk just briefly about over-the-counter medications.
Yeah, the over-the-counter medications, typically the younger population will dabble with over-the-counter because they can't get their hands on alcohol or drugs. So one area that they dabble in is the cough and cold medication. What they're looking for it's not just Robitussin or NyQuil, is cough and cold medication that has an active ingredient called dextromethorphan, DXM, or DM for short. So if you see lots of different medications like that in a medicine cabinet or in your kid's room, it could be an indication that they're dabbling with that. What does that mean? Well, they'll probably take up to 30 times the the recommended dosage of that because they like to get a hallucinogenic effect, and that's what it will give them, so they think. A lot of times they'll just get sick from it, and it's not very healthy for them. Some of the slang terms for this are Robotripping, Tussin, Orange Crush, Seropad, different things like that. So if you see any of these slang terminology, that may indicate that that's something that they're doing with the cough and cold medication. Also, I wanted to remind all of you that if you wanted a deeper dive into what we're talking about tonight, we're definitely hitting this on a high level, but we have a website called topsecretproject.org. So feel free at any point in time to go in there if you would like resources or more information about things. You can do that. Otherwise, you can call us or email us, and we'd be more than happy to do so.
And there are handouts in the back of the room. Many of you grab those. Most of the handouts have that website on there as well. So if there's anything we talked about tonight that you're curious about or want more information about, there's a lot of information on that website.
Tylenol, the active ingredient is acetaminophen, of course, for aches and pains. But kids think it's an easy way to end their life, so they will take massive doses of this, and it causes liver failure, but unfortunately that's a very, very painful death. Sudafed, we all know with the Breaking Bad and making a methamphetamine. Methamphetamine, by the way, is alive and well, and actually is in epidemic proportions in the state of Minnesota and Wisconsin. Last but not least, Imodium AD and anti-diarrhea. Why would anybody want to take that for abuse, right? What it has an active ingredient called loperamide. And what they have found in massive doses, like 300 caplets or more, individuals will get an opioid type high. So individuals are taking this to get off their pain medication because they can't get off their pain medication alone, or they're taking it in reverse to get high. So numerous ways. Now, I probably wasn't going to put that on there, but one presentation, a woman came up to me and actually said, "Thank you so much for putting that on there. I just lost my niece to an overdose of Imodium." So it does happen, it is out there, and we just want to make you aware.
So we're going to talk a little bit about e-cigarettes, vaping, juuling. All of these things are the same thing. The 10th and 12th grade annual increase in e-cigarette use was the largest ever recorded for any substance in the 44 years that the Monitoring the Future study has tracked adolescent drug use. So the Monitoring the Future study is sort of the national version of the Minnesota Student Survey that we talked about early on. So it tracks drug trends, mental health, and a number of other things that impact our kids. So vaping, e-cigs, juuling, all of that use has skyrocketed. Both Cindy and I are prevention professionals through the state of Minnesota, and we know a couple of things about prevention, that the less harmful something is perceived, the more likely kids are to use it. E-cigs, unfortunately, are perceived as far less harmful than a traditional combustible cigarette. So even though we've seen traditional cigarette use go down significantly year after year after year for the last decade or two, these devices have nicotine in them and a number of other chemicals, many of which we don't yet know because we haven't conducted all of the research to determine that. So they're perceived as less harmful. The other thing that we know about prevention is that the easier a drug or a chemical or a substance is to get, the more likely they are to use it. So e-cigs, vaping, juuls, all considered fairly easy to get when you compare it to some of the other substances. And so this is part of what's at play here for this particular area. E-cigarettes, short for electronic cigarettes, here's a number of different visuals of what they could look like. Some of these are the older school versions, but still very much in use today. If you see little bottles of oil, particularly if they have a pungent odor or smell, that oftentimes is oil used for electronic cigarettes. There are over 450 flavors on the market, many of which are designed to be marketed towards young people, like unicorn juice and 7-Up and Skittles and all sorts of different things. As I understand it, a lot of states and jurisdictions are working to pass legislation to limit or completely eradicate the ability for e-cig distributors to sell those flavors, because if e-cigs were just sort of flavorless devices that delivered nicotine, the appeal to young people would go almost to zero. And so that has passed in some areas, other areas are working on it, so that's certainly something to keep your eye out for, because that's a big part of what's attractive about this for young people. You can even see here there's an e-cigarette that looks like a car key fob, so they can be very clever with how they disguise these. This is on the wrong page. The bracelets on the lower left-hand side, those are not e-cigarettes, but those are actually, they can be pipes used to smoke marijuana. And so you might have seen in the room, there were bracelets around the knobs of the bedroom and necklaces that could be smoking devices for marijuana or traditional tobacco.
You know, I wanted to mention too about e-cigarettes and vaping. We've heard a lot in the news about that recently. And I just read an article yesterday. We get updates daily on different things that they've done a lot of studies. And today I think there's over 2,000 illnesses with vaping and 30 plus deaths related to it. And they're still really trying to figure this out, what's going on. And at first they thought maybe it was a vitamin E oil and that was getting too hot, and maybe that was the issue. But the Mayo Clinic came out with a statement just yesterday indicating that it could be due to, they feel like the lungs that they're researching, they're chemical burns. And it looks like these chemical burns are happening after vaping. So again, they're still not really sure what exactly it is, but it's not good. And you're probably all aware of what's going on in the news with that. But I just kind of wanted to give you the update that I just read yesterday on that, which is very, very interesting.
Another speculation that they've had around sort of the cause as it relates to these illnesses and the deaths is it tends to skew younger to the people that it's impacting. And so they're trying to hypothesize whether it's people who have ever smoked traditional cigarettes versus people who have never smoked traditional cigarettes and have only smoked the e-cigarettes, and something about sort of the condition of their lungs, those who have smoked traditional versus those who have not. And they're actually saying it's a disadvantage for the young people who have never smoked a traditional cigarette, who are going straight to these electronic devices, and that could somehow, some way be linked to what we're seeing. But again, as Cindy said, they're still knee-deep in research and trying to figure out the correlation between all of these cases that we've seen nationwide. Another thing to note about vaping and e-cigarette use is you absolutely can, and they absolutely do, use these devices to smoke marijuana, and marijuana wax in particular. And so that is something to be aware of as well. They do, on occasion, sell nicotine-free e-cig oils. Not very frequently, but what parents will tell us they hear all the time from their kids is, oh no, there's no nicotine in this oil, I'm just vaping the flavor because I like the flavor of the unicorn juice or whatever. They don't sell it or distribute it at the rate at which kids are reporting that they're using it. So that's one thing to be aware of if you've heard that from kids that you know before. While it's theoretically possible that it's nicotine-free, not at the rate that we've seen it reported, certainly. I want to talk just a little bit about Juuls because that's kind of probably what you're hearing about most as the most common brand of e-cigarettes, particularly with young people. It's a brand that didn't exist prior to 2015. You can see what most of them look like here in the corner. They look like flash drives. Traditionally, there were a couple of these in the room. You probably didn't notice them unless you have seen these or know what these look like. In fact, we've had teachers tell us they've charged their kids Juuls on their computers thinking that they were charging their flash drives, even though I've explained to the teachers, since when do you need to charge flash drives? So we do this presentation for teachers too to help them out. But one single Juul cartridge, which if you pull the cartridge out is actually about this big, holds anywhere from 1 to 2 packs worth of nicotine. And so what becomes really difficult about it is when you're smoking a pack of cigarettes, you're very aware of each cigarette that you smoke. These, because there's not a stick that you take out and smoke and then you crumple up the pack and throw it away, it's harder to sort of be aware of how much you're consuming. And so kids can go through multiple pods a day and not really know that they could be consuming 4 to 6 packs worth of nicotine daily.
Another thing I wanted to just mention about the e-cigs is with the regular cigarette industry, it's a highly regulated industry. The e-cigs, not so much. The vaping and all of that, the CDC got way behind. And so there are so many companies out there and so many places making these oils, making the jewels, making all sorts of different kinds of oils. And with that, they don't know what's really in them because of the lack of regulatory guidelines. So the CDC is definitely working on it right now because of all the deaths and all of the sickness that's happening. So that's just another reason.
Has anybody seen like TV commercials for these, or something called Views, which is another sort of electronic cigarette? I see a couple head nods. When's the last time you saw a TV commercial for a cigarette? Like decades, it feels like, right? Just because they're viewed as two totally separate things, even though essentially they have some of the same chemical makeup. So these are under completely different regulations than traditional tobacco cigarettes, and so they're not following the same regulations. So all of the places that we worked hard for decades to take cigarette advertising out of and to get it away from our kids so that they weren't tempted, now we're seeing it pop up with these until we can get caught up and get the same control over it. So there's just a lot going on with this. Any particular questions or things that you've been wondering about as it relates to vaping or e-cigs or juuling that we haven't touched on, that you want to make sure we touch on? Yes?
Where I'm from, Stillwater area, they had a thing where the patents were all because of marijuana use in them. And it was a big deal back where I'm from. But I've understood the people I know who have narcotic dogs say that the narcotic dogs can't smell the marijuana in those because of the scents, the fruit scents or whatever. And at this time they start.
So the question is, can narcotics dogs who are trained to detect marijuana odor smell marijuana that's used in electronic cigarettes, especially where they're using the oil that is really pungent and has a ton of smell to it when it smells like candy or fruit or what have you, which can create a challenge. We've heard kind of mixed messages from law enforcement. A lot of law enforcement that's agreed with you wholeheartedly, that said absolutely not, they're really having a difficult time detecting it. Other law enforcement, in particular one from a school 10 minutes from here, that direction, saying that they've actually had some luck. Part of it depends on the mixture and the concentration of both the oil and the marijuana and how concentrated the marijuana wax is that they're using too. But it's certainly creating some confusion. And it's also difficult to detect for humans because if there's marijuana wax that's melted into the oil that's used in the e-cigarettes, the odor of the e-cigarette oil is so strong, it's really hard to detect the traditional marijuana smell. So it's creating a lot of challenges, certainly. I just want to throw this graph up here to show you how quickly the sales of Juuls have grown from 2017 to 2018. This is this is in a matter of months. It's gone from 24% of market share to 75% of the market share. And the majority of the users of this product are young people. And so this is just something to be aware of and keep your eye out for. And feel free certainly afterwards if you have other questions about this area. I know this is a topic we could do a whole separate presentation on for parents. Yes, question here.
What's the cost of
So the question is, what's the cost of juuling? It depends on what device you use, what brand you use. Juuls can run anywhere from $20 to $40 for what they call a starter pack. And then the pods you can get anywhere from $5 to $25. You can get them online, you can get them in stores. Every market is different. So there's quite a bit of range, but they're not terribly off from what you would see from traditional cigarettes. Just keeping in mind the dose there. Did you have a question or a comment here? I thought I saw a hand. Somebody else? So some of the other devices can be a little bit more expensive, like some of the older e-cigarettes. The larger ones that are the handheld ones, those can run upwards of $100 to get one of those that are really nice. So if you confiscate that from a kid, they're going to be really upset because they've invested in that. The oils, those oils can run $40, $50, $20. So there's a pretty vast spread, but they can be an investment, especially if it's a consistent, habitual, everyday thing that they're doing. All right, shifting gears here again. I'm gonna cruise through this really quickly because I'm just aware I've got about 25 minutes left. I wanted to touch base just briefly on both anxiety and depression, again, because of how much overlap there is in sort of mental health issues as it relates to addiction. So I want to talk about anxiety briefly and sort of what anxiety is. A lot of us talk about the feelings of anxiety. I feel anxious before I step up in front of a room where there's 4 cameras in the back of the room. And that's an okay feeling. That's a healthy feeling that sort of propels me and gives me energy. But there's also feelings of anxiety that are prolonged, that impact my day-to-day functioning. The ones where I call Brian and I say, you know what, I can't come. I can't do it. I'm too afraid, I'm too anxious, I know I made this commitment, I'm not going to be here, I'm worried about my math test, I can't go to school, now I can't go to school for the rest of the week. So there's feelings of anxiety and then there's anxiety disorders. And feelings of anxiety, perfectly normal, perfectly healthy, but when we see an anxiety disorder, where it starts to impact day-to-day functioning, that's where we'd want to look at involving a professional to potentially do an assessment, to look at what might be going on and look at some different resources and tools to support that anxiety. And here are some different signs and symptoms of anxiety. Obviously feeling nervous, restless, sense of impending danger, panic, or doom particularly. If it's difficult to explain, if I can articulate, I'm nervous for my math test tomorrow, that's a little different than I'm really worried but I don't know why. Trouble concentrating and thinking, having trouble sleeping, having the urge to avoid things we talked about, having difficulty controlling worry. I know there's a great counseling staff here in the school, so if your kids are struggling with any of these things, certainly there's resources here that they could reach out to explore some of these things. Depression also, same thing. Kids get sad, they go through breakups, they don't win that important football game, they don't get the grades that they want to get. There's a lot of things that can really throw them off. But when they have a depressive disorder to the point where it's negatively impacting the way they feel, the way they think, and how they act for a prolonged period of time, again, now we're looking at a situation where we'd want to involve a professional who could do an assessment and help get them connected to support. The #1 and the #2 mental health diagnosis we see for our kiddos coming into treatment are anxiety, #1, depression, #2. And 98% of our kids coming into treatment have a mental health diagnosis prior to coming into treatment with us. And so a lot of kids will tell us, well, hey, I started smoking pot because I was feeling anxious, and man, that was the only thing that worked for me. So these are just really important things to kind of stay on top of and make sure that they're getting help, resources, and support if you notice some of these things with your kiddos. Here's some depression signs and symptoms, nothing that's going to be totally foreign to you guys. Loss of energy, low self-esteem, feelings of worthlessness or restlessness. Change in grades, getting into trouble at school. And actually, a lot of these things could be applicable for a lot of things for your kiddos. If you see a significant change in grades, a significant change in sleeping patterns, a significant change in eating patterns, a significant change in peer group, a significant change in activities that they participate in, any of those things, alone or coupled, would be an indication that you kind of want to do some digging there and find out what's perpetuating that change. So keep that in mind. That being said, we can't do anything for our kids unless we know that they're struggling. We don't know how to help them unless we know that there's something going on. So the safety of our kids trumps their privacy. I said this early on. That doesn't mean go home and do a prison-style shakedown and flip the mattress. But it can mean intentionally involve yourself in your kid's space. I had a conversation with a mom one time who, talking about drug-sniffing dogs. The school had a drug-sniffing dog out. The dog came a couple times of the year, and kid rolled up to the school. The dog hit on the car, found drugs, weapons, and paraphernalia in the trunk. Kid was charged with 3 felonies. And she said, hey Jess, you know what, I've been in his room a million times and never once thought to look in his car. And potentially had she thought to do that, maybe there could have been conversations or help that was sought that could have prevented him being charged with 3 felonies that day. And so just involving yourselves in your kids' environment and being kind of on the lookout for these things. And so I'm going to have Cindy read this for you.
Years after the tragedy, I picked up a parenting magazine in a waiting room featuring an ethical parenting quiz. I got all 10 questions right, except for, would you read your child's private journal? The correct answer, according to the parenting magazine, was no. I know it would have been my answer too when Dylan was alive, but it would not be my answer now. When we search our children's rooms or read their journals, we risk that they will feel betrayed. However, they may be hiding problems they cannot manage themselves.
So this was written by a woman named Sue Klebold in a book called A Mother's Reckoning. Does anybody know who Sue Klebold is? See a few head nods. Sue Klebold is the mother of Dylan Klebold, who on April 20th, 1999, entered Columbine High School and killed 12 of his classmates and a fellow teacher. And this was written by his mother. His mother wrote a book several years after the Columbine school shooting. And the book explored kind of 2 things. It explored, one, her grief as a mother who lost her son because he took his life that day, but also the guilt she had as a mother who had a son who caused that amount of grief for so many other families. I read this book as we were sort of working on this presentation and building it with all the organizations that Cindy mentioned at the beginning, and this really stood out to me. This passage stood out to me, and she talked about, in the book, not being allowed to go into Dylan's room for several months after the Columbine school shooting. For the first few months, they weren't allowed in their home because law enforcement had taken over the home for investigations. Once they were allowed back in the home, it took her another few months before she could bring herself to go into his room. Once she went into his room, she found 2 things that she believes, had she found before April 20th, 1999, she could have possibly prevented what happened that day. Now, of course, hindsight is 20/20, but you know, what she writes about really, I think, illustrates what we're inviting you today, which is really involve yourself in your kids' environments. And so the first thing that she found was a pack of cigarettes in Dylan's dresser drawer. And the reason why that was significant to her is because she sort of had this gut feeling that Dylan had been smoking, and she had asked him about it a few times. She didn't really get anywhere with it. He kept denying it. He didn't really, he kept kind of getting angry with her. Mom, quit asking me that. I would never do that. It's gross. But yet there was just something telling her something was off. She was maybe smelling something. And so when she found that pack of cigarettes, it really started to connect the dots for her, just how much he had been keeping from her and how little she knew about the life that her son was leading. The second thing she found was in her son's medicine cabinet. She had been in his bathroom before, but she had never once thought to open his medicine cabinet. What she found in his medicine cabinet was a bottle of St. John's wort. Does anybody know what St. John's wort is used for? It's a natural remedy for depression. What that told her when she found the bottle of St. John's wort was not only that her son was struggling with depression to the extent that he was trying to find a way to feel better, but that he had been struggling with it for so long that the bottle that she found had long since been expired. So, while this is an extreme example, it's a very relevant example of a mother's story of a time where she believes, had she involved herself in the environment of her kid, she potentially could have changed the outcome of not only his life, but really history. And so this is the things we're asking you to think about today as you kind of exist in your worlds and exist in your kids' lives, not only in their physical lives, but in so much of where our kids live their lives now, in their digital lives, their social media, what they do when they're online, who they're talking to, where they're spending their time, knowing what social media apps they're using, what video games they're playing, who they're talking to when they're on there. All of that can be really critical in keeping them safe. Let's see, we're going to just talk about a few things. A lot of our kids are really healthy. According to the Minnesota Student Survey, about 80% of our kids are making healthy choices. They feel good about their future. So even though we've probably terrified you, most of our kids are doing the right thing. Most of our kids feel great about things. And a big part of this conversation is making sure that we keep them on that track. And so here's a few tips and ideas of how to do that. It's just making sure that you continue to initiate the good conversations. It's not only talking to them when they're late with their homework or when you're upset that they haven't cleaned their room, but continuing to have positive conversations. Making sure that you listen to them, making sure you're open and honest about your thoughts and feelings. Obviously creating an open environment. A lot of this is probably stuff that you all do every day. And sharing your own values. Sometimes as parents, we're the only people that will share the voice that we have. You know, we really don't want you to drink until you're 21. We really don't want you to use illegal substances. Some of those things they will only ever hear from us. And so it's important that we share whatever those values may be. Here's a few other things. If you are concerned, if you do find something, if you are wondering if there's something going on, you don't want to apologize if you have to talk to them about something that's bothering you. You want to stay calm. You want to use I statements. You certainly want to follow through, and you want to be a parent, not a friend. Our kids have the opportunity to have hundreds of friends in their life, but they only have the opportunity to have 2, or maybe if you're a family like me, 3 or 4 parents, and they need us to be their parents. Their friends aren't going to be their parents, and maybe as they get older we become their friends, but they really need us to be the ones that are holding them accountable and setting those restrictions and those guidelines and those rules. And so if they're struggling or if you find something that they're concerned about, make sure that you're helping to keep them safe, because sometimes it's not going to be their friends who do it. Sometimes it is. A lot of kids have good friends too, but make sure that as parents we're also doing that for them. What can you do? There's a lot of things that you can do. You can investigate. You can just kind of keep your eyes open. For me, what that looks like at my home with my teenagers is when I want to know what they want for dinner, I'm not texting them saying, hey, what do you want on your pizza? But I'm going down in their room and kind of taking a casual look around saying, hey, what do you want on your pizza? And seeing if anything looks out of place. They roll their eyes, but if something smells funny, if they look like they've been crying, if they quickly shut their laptop, I can tell a lot from unannounced showing up in their room, right? That would give me enough to say, now I gotta stick around for a little bit and see what's going on here, like, so, why'd you shut your laptop? What you doing? And so I'm that mom. So it can be that. It's, you know, there's a lot of different ways that this can look. Modeling healthy behavior, educating yourself on the issues. All of you get an A+ for that tonight. Just making sure you're kind of in the know about what's going on. Eliminating or reducing access. If you leave here tonight saying, like, what's one thing I can do to help kids? Here's one thing you can do. Number 1 place kids say that they get the drugs or the alcohol that they use is from their house. The number 2 place that kids say they get the drugs or the alcohol that they use is from their friend's house. So if you have pills, alcohol, anything at your home that's not locked up, you can lock it up. If you have prescription pills that you're not going to use, every county has prescription drug drop-off locations. You can Google it and you can get rid of those. We don't prefer you flush them in the toilet because it's an environmental hazard. But even just reducing access, even if you don't have kids, can be very helpful, because we heard from a kid in our treatment center who said his favorite way to get prescription pills was to go to houses that were for sale on the real estate market that were having open houses. And he would go with his buddies, and one kid would go in and talk to the realtor, and another kid would go straight for the bathroom. And they would have a coat, and they would go into the cabinet, and they would unload all the prescription medications, didn't even look what they were, into their pockets, and head out of the house. And that could have been a home that didn't even have kids, and somehow those medications were getting into kids' hands. So that's one really tangible thing you could do tonight to help keep our kiddos safe. You can also set boundaries and expectations. I'll go over these briefly. Setting a curfew and staying awake. If we set a curfew of midnight but we're not awake, to make sure they made it home, that kind of defeats the purpose. Also kind of seeing what condition they're in when they come home. Have they been crying? Do they look like they're high? Are they stressed out or angry? That can be important to look at. Disallowing overnight phone use. I could do a whole nother 4-hour thing on technology use. I promise I won't, but if you ever want me to come back, I will. There's nothing, you know, my dad used to always tell me there's nothing that happens after midnight that you need to be involved in. There's nothing happening on Snapchat or TikTok or Instagram or anything at 2 o'clock in the morning that they need to be involved in. Social media and video games are dramatically impacting the sleep that our kids are getting, which is dramatically impacting their mental health, which is making them dramatically more susceptible to things like substance use and anxiety and depression, and you start to see the interrelationship of all of these things. So there's no reason they need to have their phones overnight. Make it easy to leave a party. For me, if I get a text message that has the letter X, I'm on my way. I'm in the car, on my way, picking up my kid. Not the time to ask questions, not the time to say, what the heck are you doing? Why are you here? That's the time to say, hey, you did the right thing. You were in an uncomfortable situation, and you got yourself out of there. And if you want to talk about it, I'm here. I always know where my kids are. I have their location. If their location is ever off for any reason, I get their phone. So that's our negotiation. That's part of our process. Everybody has a little bit of a different thing, but that's how I always know where they are. Obviously, communicating with each other. You guys seem to have a really strong community of parents here, so I assume that this is probably happening, but it's important to remember that. We've talked about paying attention to differences in behavior. If something is different, figure out why. Could just be because they're tired, or they're bummed because they got to be on their math test, but it could be because there's something more going on there too, so make sure you look into that. Let's see. Outline reasonable consequences and follow through. Setting a consequence and not following through is more harmful than just not setting the consequence. So if I tell my daughter she has to make her bed every day, and then I'll give her an allowance, and then she doesn't make her bed at all this week, and I still give her the allowance, basically what I'm teaching her is just ignore everything I say because I don't mean it. So make sure you're following through on any consequences that you set, and listen to your instincts. I talked about that with Sue Klebold. We have instincts for a reason. If something feels off, pursue it until you're satisfied with what you figure out. If something feels wrong, if your kid feels different, figure it out and listen to it until you know what's going on. Okay, we've got just a couple minutes. I'm gonna read this text message. Hi Mom, I'm home early. Do you know what time we're going to dinner? I wasn't sure if you were on a conference call or not, so I didn't come and ask you in person. This text message has several indications that the young person who sent this text message was using drugs. Anybody have any idea what they are?
Punctuation.
Punctuation. Young people don't text with punctuation, that's number one. So you're a good detective, you've learned something. Anybody else picked up anything tonight? Not wanting to ask in person. They don't want me to see them. That's another good one.
We want a time frame.
Time frame. Very conscientious of the time. Anything else? Somebody said very considerate. We don't always know our teens to be so polite. Could be fair. Too many words. No abbreviations, right? So I can tell you about this from firsthand experience. I got this text message from my kid. I worked at the Hazel and Betty Ford Foundation for 15 years. And you'd think if anybody had a kid that wasn't going to smoke pot, it'd be my kid, who's come to the treatment center with me since she was this tall. The one who used to draw pictures for the patients, the one who used to go sneak ice cream from the chef, the one who sat in my office with me and colored pictures, who listens to me talk about drugs forever and ever and ever. And she sent me this text message, and I knew without even seeing her, she was using drugs. It was the first time I knew. She doesn't use punctuation. She always abbreviates. She doesn't care if I'm on a conference call for work. She always busts into my office. She was early. She's never early, but she was like 3 hours early. And I was like, okay, something drastically changed here. And so I knew right away something was up. So I texted her and I said, hey, just stop on down to my office. And right away when I saw her, her eyes were red, her speech was very slow, and I confirmed what I felt in my gut, which was that she was high. And I didn't let her know right away because I'm trying to teach myself all these things I teach everybody else for years now, which is don't react, don't be in my emotions, figure out what my next step is, stay calm, don't get scared. So I was just like, all right, I'll let you know when dinner is. And so the path I chose to take, whether it was the right path or not, was I'm gonna like wait this out for a couple of days until I am ready to have a conversation. And whether I knew it at the time or not, it was kind of a good choice because for the next couple of days, she was like terrified. Constantly kind of wondering what the next move was going to be, and like handing me stuff from the fridge, just waiting for the mic to drop and for the conversation to happen. So she probably created kind of more terror for her than I was going to, but by the time we finally had a conversation about it, we were able to have a conversation. Not a yelling match, not tears, not arguments, and we were able to figure out, okay, where do we go from here? What do we do? What's our plan? What's our next step? So I share this with you to let you know, addiction can impact anyone, anywhere, at any time. And the fact of the matter is, there's help, there's recovery, there's hope, there's healing, and there are a ton of resources, especially if kids have parents who've got their eyes open, who are looking out for their kids, and who are willing to reach in and help their kids if they're struggling. So, that being said, I gotta double check if I'm missing any other slides here, and say that most teens feel good about their futures. Most of our kids are making good choices. Most of our kids are doing the right thing and have great relationships with their parents, and we want to keep it that way. So thank you guys for being here. We invite you to check the room back out one more time. If you have any individual questions, we'll hang out for a little bit afterwards, but thank you so much, and thank you guys for having us here tonight. Have a great night.